We're going to start out with some basic coding, and the best way to learn coding is to actually do it. So this whole section, or the next few sections, are going to be based on exercises, and I'm going to run through those exercises, but I encourage you to do them as well. But I want to run through them just so you can see things work, see how things are put together, and I think that'll make it a lot easier when you go to do it. Now again, we're going to start real basic, but by the end you'll have some very good skills for doing different data manipulation, and this can be a very powerful tool when you're working with different data sets or data that's in different formats that you need to bring together. So let's scroll down here to the first exercise, and all we're going to do right here is just read a file and then print the contents of the file to the screen. So what we need is we need a data file, something that has some data in it, and then we need some code that's going to read that file and print it out to the screen. So I've already created these files, but this is the information that we're going to start with, and you can create any data file you want, but if you don't have a data file, just follow these steps. It's probably the easiest thing to do. So once we have our file, and again it's going to be in a CSV format, comma separated. So we see here's this first row is like the header row, so we have the city and state, and then some data rows here, and the city and the state are separated by a comma throughout. Then we're going to go into idle and open up the Python editor, and we're going to create this, we're going to add this code to the file, and then we're going to run it, and you can use any of the methods. I'll probably just run it right from the idle editor, but you can use any of the methods that we discussed previously. So first of all, let's take a look at the data file that we have. Okay, so I just called it data21.csv. I typed out this information and I saved it in my ctemp data directory. And then I opened up Python, and I went to Python idle, the shell, and I opened up the editor, and here is the code that I typed. And the nice thing again about the editor is that it will color code the line statements. So you know if it's got a hashtag here and it's a comment, you'll know that it won't actually execute. It's there just for documentation purposes, right down here. And then here you can see when things are in single quotes, it's a string. So anyways, this kind of helps you visualize your data or your code, and it will help you identify if there's any errors. The other thing to remember about Python is that each computer programming language has its own syntax. Some will require a semicolon at the end to define the end of a statement. Everyone does things a little bit differently, but in Python they use indentation. So for this for loop here, you have to make sure that everything that belongs to that for loop is indented at the same place, or with the same indentation. If there was a statement below it and it was out here, then the Python program would know that that wasn't part of the for loop here. So anyways, type in this code, save it in a file, and in my case I saved it in ctemp code and then code21.py, and then just run it. And what you should see is this data outputted. So we're going to use this statement to open the file, ctemp data21, which is this file here. And then the code is going to read in one line at a time and print it to the screen. That's what this code here does. Let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. Okay, so we can see that it just ran it and printed everything out to the screen. You can see that there's a little extra space in between each item, and we'll talk about how to get rid of that later. But that does it for this first exercise. Very simple code, very simple data file, but this is how you will start building your skills, is just taking it one little building block at a time, and eventually you'll see that you'll have a lot of capabilities by the time we get to the end of section 15. In this next exercise, we're going to use the same data file, but we're going to write code that will actually extract only the lines that meet our criteria. So we're going to do that with an if-then statement. And down here we're just showing here that if the line meets the criteria, then it will be printed to the screen. If the line does not meet the criteria, then nothing happens. So once again, we're going to use this data21.csv file that we used in the last exercise. We're going to open up idle, and then from there, since I already have the file created, I'm going to do file open. If you're doing this for the first time, you'd probably have to do file new file and then create a new file. Finally, we'll enter in this code, and a lot of the code is going to be the same. I've highlighted down here what's going to be different. So, well, here and here, this section here is going to be different. Up here we did the same thing. We opened the file, we read in each line. Now we're going to say if this criteria here is in the line that we're looking at currently, then print it to the screen, and if it's not, then just do nothing and move on to the next. Now another thing to note down here is that if Python is case sensitive, so if you type if with a capital IF or capital I, capital F, something like that, you may get a syntax error. So make sure that if is in lowercase. And then once you save the file, you can run it. So let's go ahead and take a look at that here. Now here's my Python shell. I did file, I did a file open, and I opened up this ctemp code22.py. That's where it's stored on my directory system, and it may be different on yours. Here is our data file. Here's our code. So now let's run it. Again, we're going to open the file. We're going to open this file. We're going to look at each single line, and if the term Atlanta is in the line, it's going to print it to the screen. So here I'm going to use this option of running it. Again, there's several ways you could run the code. I'm just going to use this option, run and run module, or alternatively F5. And so down here we see, let's bring this down a little bit. We see the code ran, and the only line we get back is Atlanta, Georgia, because that's the only line that met our criteria. And so that's what we would expect. Out of all these data rows, the only one that contained Atlanta was this row, Atlanta, Georgia. So this is one way that you can filter out data in a larger data set, and you could reduce that down to a filtered set of data, and eventually we'll see how we can output that to another file. But this is all we're going to do for now until the next exercise. So far we've been able to open up a file, read each line, and even filter by a specific criteria, but as you notice, that criteria was hard-coded and there was no way to change it. In this exercise we're going to receive user input in order to filter the data. So the only thing that's going to change really is this section right here where it says get users find criteria, and we'll see that in the code here. So here's our code. Once again, I've already typed this out and saved it as a file. You'll need to retype this, or you could even copy and paste it from the reference guide if you wanted. But I would recommend typing it in. You don't have to type in necessarily all the comments. They're there just to explain what each line does. So there's really not a lot of typing, but if you type it out, then you'll get a sense of when you make a mistake, where you make that mistake, and it just helps you to learn. Okay, so once again, we're going to read in a file. This is the file name. We're using the same exact file again. And down here, this is where we find, or we look for each line, look through each line, and then see if there's a criteria that's met, and if so, we print it out. Now again, before it was hard-coded, but in this case, this is what changes here. We're going to define a variable called var filter. We're going to assign that to whatever comes back from this function here. So this input is going to tell the user who's at the keyboard to enter in a find criteria. When they do that, that value will get assigned to var filter, and then that filter will then be used down here to see if it's in the line. So in this case, we're going to choose a different city. Maybe I'll try Dallas, because before it was hard-coded to Atlanta. So let's see what happens there. So let's go ahead and just run this, and let's see what happens. Okay, so now instead of just printing out the result, it says enter find criteria. So now the program is waiting for me to do something. So I'll type in Dallas and hit enter. And now it found the city and state that I was looking for. So once again, if we could go back and look at our code, what's happening here is we're pausing the program just for a moment to get the find criteria instead of just setting this to Atlanta. This gives you a lot more interaction with your user and a lot more flexibility in what the user may want to do. And then once you get that criteria, your program can make decisions based on that criteria. In this case, we're just doing a simple filter. We're just looking for a word and returning a value, but you could use it to go down different paths of the code depending on what the user wanted to do. This is a pretty simple line, pretty straightforward, but it actually gives your program a lot more flexibility than just hard coding everything. We'll continue now to build on our capabilities by learning how to write output to a file instead of just the screen. So in this section, what we're going to do is basically the same thing that we've been doing, except for we'll be writing to an output file. And in particular, we'll call it a CSV file, although the structure is already in that kind of a format. Later on, when we do data manipulation, we'll actually be constructing the data to be in a CSV format. We'll just get used to using the CSV extension in this case. So what we're going to do is open up the same data file, go down here to the code, and in this case we're going to have to open the file that we're going to read the data from, open a second file that we're going to write to, and in this last parameter here you'll see that there's an R. We've added that on there, and that's just an option to tell the program that we're just going to read from this file. Down here we provide a W, which means we're going to write to the file, or that we allow that permission to write to this file. And here you can see once again we're using data21.csv as our data file, and then this is where we're going to put our output file. The code is basically the same, except for down here we're going to call a method on this file object. Now this is, I'm not going to get too much into object-oriented explanations, but really what we're doing here when we create this variable is we're creating this variable to represent an object, and the object is this file. So this file object down here has a method which is .write, and then in these parentheses we can tell it what we want to write to that file. Finally, we're going to close both files, and be sure to include the parentheses at the end, because again this is just another method that is associated to this file object. Methods are very similar to functions. The only exception or the difference is that a function is not tied to an object, where a method is tied to the object. So this method or function, this closed method here, is tied to a file object, and so you want to close out the files at the end. And if you don't include the parentheses, you may not get any output in your output file, so this part is important. Finally, if you go to the reference guide, I've provided a couple extra notes, and you can consult the Python documentation for additional options. There's also an A for append. Now one thing to keep in mind is when you use the W option here, it's going to write a new file. It's going to create a file, which means that if there's a file there already, it's going to overwrite that file. So you could lose some data. So make sure this is the option that you want. Alternatively, you could use the A option, which means append. So if you have a data file and you want to just add to it, then you could use the A option, and that will append to an existing file. Using a W will create a new file, or it'll overwrite an existing file, so just be careful and choose the option that you intend to use. Now let's take a look at the code. We'll go ahead and print the output to the screen still, but in addition we'll write to a file, and then at the end we'll go and look at the file to see that that same output is there. So if we go ahead and run, it's going to ask us for some criteria. In this case I'll choose Chicago. And so it went through that file, it found Chicago, and it outputted that line, which is Chicago, Illinois. Now if we look at the output file, we can see it here. And if I open it, you can see that the file contains Chicago, Illinois. And just to prove that, you can see the time down here is 7:24 and the time here is 7:24. So this file just got created, and this is what was in the output. So what we wrote to that file was the same thing we wrote to the screen here. So this is going to give you a really good capability if you have a large data set to be able to extract or filter just what you want and create a new file that's something more manageable or tailored to somebody else's needs. One last technique to learn before we move into the data manipulation section is to be able to extract the next line. So up to this point we've been finding a criteria and then extracting that line. In some cases, depending on how your data is arranged, it might be beneficial to find a criteria and extract the following line or the next line. So we're going to do that here in this exercise. Again, the code looks very much the same. The only difference is when we go to extract, we're going to use this technique here. And so we're going to once again get a filter or get a criteria, ask for a criteria. We're going to find that criteria, and then instead of extracting that line, we're going to extract the next line. Okay, so let's take a look at the code. First of all, let's look at our data file. So in this case, if we were to select, let's say, Chicago, what should return is New York, New York, because we're going to go through this list, we're going to find Chicago, and then we're going to select the next line. So that's ideally what's going to happen. Here's the code, so let's go ahead and run it. So we wanted to find Chicago, and our theory is that it's going to return New York, so sure enough it does. So this is a technique you may not use all the time, but occasionally your data will be constructed in such a way that this will be very handy.